"You'll freeze out there alone faster than you'll freeze in here with us," Silas Pruitt said, spitting tobacco into the frost-hard dirt, and half the wagon train laughed with him. Naomi Coulter didn't laugh. She was already tightening the last strap on her mule's pack, her breath coming out in short white clouds that vanished before they finished rising. The sky behind her had gone the color of a day-old bruise, greenish-gray and swollen low over the ridge, and the wind had shifted twice in the last hour. First from the west, sharp and dry, then from the north, carrying a wet mineral smell that Naomi's grandmother used to call the smell before the world goes white. "There's a storm coming," Naomi said, not for the first time. "A big one. We need to get off this ridge and into the timber before nightfall." "We got a schedule," said Pruitt. He was the wagon master, a broad man with a beard the color of ash and hands that had never once, in Naomi's 3 months on the trail, trembled at anything. That was supposed to be reassuring. Today it looked like something else. Today it looked like stubbornness wearing the mask of courage. 2 more days to Sweetwater Pass. We push through. "You push through a blizzard on an open ridge, you don't make Sweetwater Pass," Naomi said. "You make graves." That was when the laughter started, low at first, from the Talbot brothers near the second wagon, then spreading down the line like a grass fire, catching on dry tongues. A woman's voice, dry too, said something about the half-breed girl and her weather magic, and Naomi felt the old familiar heat crawl up the back of her neck. The heat that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with 26 years of being looked at sideways. Her mother had taught her to read sky the way other children were taught to read letters. Cloud shape, wind shift, the particular hush that fell over birds before ice came down from the mountains hard and fast and merciless. Her mother had died in a storm just like this one 11 years back, in a cabin that hadn't been built to hold against wind that could strip bark off a live oak. Naomi had learned. She did not intend to die not learning. "I'm leaving the trail," she said, loud enough that the whole line could hear it, though her voice didn't shake. "There's a hollow 2 miles east, out of the wind, with a rock overhang big enough for shelter. I'm taking my wagon there before dark. Anyone who wants to come is welcome." Nobody moved. 23 wagons, 41 grown souls and 11 children, and not one of them broke rank to follow her, except for a boy 9 years old, dark-eyed and thin as a fence post, who tugged his mother's skirt and asked in a whisper if they could go with the lady who knew about weather. His mother, a tired-faced widow named Ruth Ashby, shushed him and looked away, ashamed of her own hesitation but not brave enough to act against it. Pruitt's voice followed Naomi as she led her mule off the ridge trail. "You go on, then. Freeze to death alone if you want. We'll wave from the pass." She didn't answer him. There wasn't a version of the sentence that would land on ears that had already decided not to hear it. She'd learned that too from a childhood of trying. By the time she reached the tree line, the wind had teeth in it. It came down off the mountain in long shuddering gusts that bent the pines sideways and drove fine ice crystals sideways into her collar, her sleeves, the seams of her boots. She counted her supplies as she walked, enough hardtack and dried venison for 4 days if she was careful, a hatchet, flint, a wool blanket doubled over the mule's back and another rolled tight in her pack, and the small leather pouch at her throat that held the only thing she had left of her mother. A smooth river stone with a single word scratched into it in her mother's careful hand. Endure. The hollow, when she reached it, was better than she'd hoped. A limestone overhang deep enough to keep off both wind and snow, with a natural windbreak of boulders at its mouth and enough dead pines scattered nearby to keep a fire burning through the worst of a long night. She set to work immediately, hauling wood, packing snow into a wall at the exposed edge of the shelter, hobbling the mule in the most protected corner. Her hands moved with the practiced calm of someone who had done this dance with death before and intended to win again. She was 3 hours into building her shelter, the sky gone the color of a healing bruise, purple shading toward black, when she heard the first scream carry down off the ridge, thin and swallowed almost instantly by the wind. She stood very still, an armful of kindling forgotten against her chest, and listened to the storm that was no longer coming. It had arrived. And somewhere up on that exposed ridge, in wagons with canvas that could not hold against what she'd read in the sky 3 hours ago, 41 people and 11 children were about to learn the same lesson her mother had taught her. The wind does not care who mocks it and who doesn't. It only cares who's ready. The scream did not come again. That was worse than if it had. Naomi stood at the mouth of her shelter with the wind screaming instead. A long, unbroken howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and she felt the choice settle onto her shoulders like a physical weight. She could stay. She had built this shelter for herself and her mule, stocked it for 4 days, and every ounce of hard-earned survival sense she owned told her that leaving it now, in full dark, with the temperature already falling past what her bones could tolerate for long, was its own kind of foolishness. She thought of Ruth Ashby's boy, the one who'd asked, in a whisper, if they could come with her. She thought of her mother, who had not had anyone offer her a hollow to shelter in 11 years ago, and had died 3 miles from a homestead that might have saved her, because the storm came faster than pride could be swallowed. "Damn it," Naomi said to the wind, and it didn't answer, and she started packing anyway. She left the fire burning. A foolish waste of fuel, maybe, but a beacon too, something to be found by if it came to that. And she took the mule, stripped of its pack now, carrying only rope, the spare blanket, and a lantern she'd have to shield with her body the whole way to keep the wind from snuffing it. 2 miles back to the ridge trail. In this wind, on foot, leading an animal that did not want to walk into a blizzard any more than she did. It would take an hour. Maybe more. She had gone perhaps a 1/4 mile when she found the first of them. It was Ruth Ashby herself, collapsed against an aspen trunk with her boy curled into her body. Both of them dusted white already, the woman's lips gone the pale blue-gray of a fish belly. Naomi's heart lurched sideways in her chest. She dropped to her knees in the snow and pressed 2 fingers to Ruth's throat and felt, faint but present, a pulse. "We tried to follow you," Ruth said, her voice a papery whisper, eyes fluttering half open. "After the wagons started going over on the ridge. The wind just... I couldn't see the trail. Don't talk. Save it." Naomi was already unwinding the rope, already thinking in the cold, clear arithmetic that fear sometimes gave her instead of taking away. 1 mule, 3 bodies including her own, 2 miles, failing light, a woman who could not walk and a boy who might not be able to either. She made her choice in the space of 1 breath. She tied the rope in a sling harness around the mule's back, hoisted Ruth up first. The woman was slight, thinned by a hard year of widowhood and a harder trail, and set the boy in front of her, wrapping her spare blanket around them both and lashing it tight enough that a fall wouldn't easily throw them. "Can you hold the rope if I need both hands?" she asked the boy. His name, she remembered now, was Eli. He nodded, teeth chattering too hard to speak, and gripped the lead rope with both small fists like it was the only solid thing left in the world. They were not 50 yards further on when Naomi heard the second voice. A man's, hoarse and half swallowed by wind, calling a name that wasn't hers. She followed it and found Silas Pruitt himself, of all people, on his knees in a drift with his lantern shattered beside him and his right leg bent at an angle no leg should bend, having gone down hard when his horse spooked and threw him somewhere back along the ridge trail. He looked up at her through a face rimed with frost and recognized her, and something in his expression, the man who 3 hours ago had laughed her off the ridge, cracked open like river ice in spring. "Coulter," he said. "I'm sorry. God help me. I'm sorry, I didn't." Later, Naomi said, and meant it. Not forgiveness offered, not yet, but a promise that the conversation existed and would happen if they both lived long enough to have it. She could not carry him. She could not leave him. She unwound the last length of rope from her own waist, looped it under his arms, and told him, flat and without warmth, that he was going to have to crawl, because she did not have the strength to drag 200 pounds of dead weight through snow that was already past her knees, and neither did the mule, already straining under Ruth and Eli's combined weight. "Every wagon on that ridge is going over," Pruitt gasped, dragging himself forward on knees and elbows while Naomi hauled the rope taut ahead of him, angling them both back toward the tree line. "Canvas is shredding. Oxen won't move, they're just standing there, freezing where they stand. How many made it off the ridge before you?" "I don't know. Some. Not enough." The wind chose that moment to shift again, a full-throated roar coming down off the exposed slope above them, carrying with it the particular high-pitched shriek of canvas tearing loose from wagon bows, and underneath it, faint, human, terrible, more voices, scattered now across the darkening ridge, calling for people who might already be past hearing. Naomi Coulter stood in the howling dark with a rope in each raw hand, a half-frozen wagon master crawling behind her and a widow and her son slung across her mule, and understood with sudden, complete clarity that she was not going to make it back to her shelter with just these three. Not while there were others out there calling. She turned her face into the wind, toward the sound of the voices, and started walking. The ridge, when Naomi finally reached its edge, was a scene out of some frozen underworld. 3 wagons had already gone over. She could see the black shapes of them below the trail, canted at broken angles, one with its wheels still spinning uselessly in the wind like a dying insect's legs. The oxen team from a 4th wagon stood exactly where Pruitt had said they would, heads down, backs already crusted white, patient and doomed in the way only animals could be, waiting for a command that was never coming because the man who should have given it was somewhere on his hands and knees 50 yards behind Naomi, being hauled toward shelter by a rope she tied herself. She left Pruitt with the mule, told him, in words too sharp to argue with, to get himself and Ruth and the boy moving toward the tree line and not to stop, not for anything, not even for her, and went alone onto the ridge with nothing but the shielded lantern and her own 2 legs and the terrible knowledge that every minute she spent finding people was a minute closer to not being able to find her own way back. She found the Talbot brothers first, the 2 young men who had laughed loudest that afternoon, huddled behind an overturned handcart with no real shelter in it at all, faces already slack with the particular stupor that came before a body simply stopped fighting the cold. She shook them both hard, screamed over the wind that sitting down was the same as lying down in a grave, and half-dragged, half-herded them upright and pointed them toward the faint orange smear of Pruitt's retreating lantern. She found an old man, Ezra Whitcomb, the trail's self-appointed preacher, who had quoted scripture at her about pride going before a fall the very first week she joined the train. Sitting with his back against a wagon wheel, praying out loud in a voice gone thin as thread, not moving, maybe not able to move. "Mr. Whitcomb." She crouched in front of him, pressed her palms to his cheeks, felt skin gone waxy and cold. "I need you to stand up. The Lord's will," he mumbled, "the Lord's will be. The Lord's will can wait until you're not dying of it," Naomi said, and hauled him up by main force, getting his arm over her shoulder, half carrying his frail weight through snow that had gone from ankle to thigh deep in the space of an hour. The wind screaming so loud now that thought itself became a kind of physical labor. Each idea wrestled into shape against a howling white noise that wanted to erase everything. It was on the way back, staggering under Whitcomb's weight, that she heard the wagon go. She would never afterward be able to describe the sound properly. Not quite a crack, not quite a scream, something in between, wood and canvas and rope all tearing loose from a frozen hillside at once, and underneath it, unmistakably, a child crying. She left Whitcomb sitting braced against a boulder, screamed at him to stay conscious, stay upright, and ran. Actually ran, her lungs burning with air too cold to properly breathe, toward the sound. The Delacroix wagon had slid sideways off the trail and jammed hard against an outcrop of rock. Canvas torn open along one whole seam, and inside it, wedged between 2 overturned trunks, was a girl of maybe 6 years old, alone, screaming for a mother who, Naomi would learn only later, had gone over the edge with the wagon's forward slide and lay somewhere below in the dark, past any help that could be offered tonight. Naomi got the girl out through the torn canvas, wrapped her inside her own coat against her body, sacrificing her last real barrier against the cold for the sake of a stranger's child, and not hesitating for 1/2 of 1 second in the doing of it, and turned to find the trail back to the tree line. That was when the real wall of the storm hit. It came as a physical thing, a solid moving mass of wind and ice that knocked her sideways, stole the breath clean out of her chest, and for 3, 4, 5 seconds, an eternity measured in heartbeats. She could see nothing at all, not the lantern light ahead, not her own hand in front of her face, nothing but roaring white and the small desperate weight of the child clutched against her ribs. "Endure," her mother's voice said, from 11 years and 1,000 miles away, from a stone hanging at Naomi's throat under 3 layers of frozen wool. "Endure." She dropped to her knees, not falling, choosing, the way a sailor chooses to ride out a wave rather than fight it, curled her body around the child, put her back to the wind, and waded through the worst of the gust with her jaw locked shut and her eyes squeezed closed and every muscle in her body screaming with the effort of simply staying present, staying conscious, staying alive for 1 more second and then 1 more after that. When the gust passed, and it did pass, storms always passed, that was the other thing her mother had taught her. that the worst moment was never the whole story. She opened her eyes to a break in the blowing snow and saw, 20 yards off and flickering nearly out, the orange smear of a lantern held by someone who had come back for her. It was Pruitt. Upright now, barely, favoring the leg twisted wrong beneath him. One arm looped through the mule's harness for support, holding the light as high as his ruined balance would allow, shouting her name into a wind that tried to steal it from his mouth before it ever reached her. They made it to the overhang an hour before true midnight, by Naomi's best guess, though time itself had gone strange and slow in the storm's grip, measured less in minutes than in the number of times she thought she might not take another step and did anyway. The fire, against all odds, had held, banked low but alive, and the sight of it, orange and impossible in the mouth of the limestone shelter, was the single most beautiful thing Naomi Coulter had ever seen in her 26 years of living. They packed the shelter tight. Ruth and Eli Ashby, the Talbot brothers still shivering too hard to speak, old Ezra Whitcomb wrapped in every spare blanket they could find, the 6-year-old Delacroix girl, whose name, they learned once her teeth stopped chattering long enough to give it, was Josephine. Pressed against Naomi's side beneath the coat that had saved her, and Silas Pruitt, his broken leg splinted crude with 2 straight branches and torn strips of blanket, sitting nearest the fire because his was the worst hurt. Among them that could still be treated by hands and not by prayer alone. For a long while nobody spoke. The wind screamed on outside, unrelenting, and inside there was only the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of 8 people breathing themselves slowly back from the edge of something none of them wanted to name aloud. It was Josephine who broke the silence, her small voice thin and raw from crying. "Is my mama coming?" Naomi felt the question land in the shelter like a stone dropped into still water, felt every adult present go very quiet, very careful, none of them willing to be the one to answer it. She pulled the girl a little closer instead, tucked the blanket tighter around her narrow shoulders, and said only, "We're going to look for her the moment it's light enough and safe enough to look. I promise you that." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth, and Naomi suspected, from the way Josephine went quiet and still against her side, that some part of the girl already understood the difference. Later, much later, the fire burned down to coals and built back up twice over. Most of the others finally sunk into the fitful half-sleep of exhaustion. Pruitt spoke, his voice low, meant only for Naomi, who sat nearest him tending the fire because sleep would not come for her either. "I've led wagon trains for 11 years, he said. "Never lost a soul I didn't have to. Told myself that was because I was careful. Because I knew this country." He stared into the flames. "Truth is I was scared of being wrong in front of people who were paying me to be right. Scared enough that I'd rather risk their necks than admit a girl half my age could read weather better than I could. You came back for me," Naomi said. "Out there. On a broken leg. That's not nothing. Wasn't enough to save what it should have saved." His jaw worked. "How many, Coulter? Out there tonight? How many didn't make it?" She didn't have an honest number to give him, not yet. Not until daylight let them count the wagons and the bodies both. And she told him so, plainly, because false comfort had never once in her life done anyone real good. He nodded slowly, and then, unexpectedly, reached into the collar of his coat and drew out something on a leather cord. A small tin medallion, dented and worn smooth by years of handling, stamped with the crude image of a compass rose. "My father's," he said, "wagon master before me. Died on the trail himself, matter of fact. Not from weather, from a fever nobody could break. He gave me this the week before, told me a good trail boss doesn't need a compass. He needs to know when to trust someone else's." He held it out to her. "I don't want your father's medallion, Mr. Pruitt. Wasn't offering it. Was showing you I understand now what he meant, and it took a blizzard and a busted leg and near about losing this whole train to finally understand it." He tucked it back beneath his collar. "You knew the sky. I should have listened the first time you told me, and I didn't, and there are people out there tonight, some of them dead, some of them I'll be digging out of snowdrifts come morning, who are going to pay for my pride instead of me paying for it myself. That's a debt I don't know how to settle." Naomi looked at him for a long moment across the low fire. At the broken leg he dragged himself and then walked on to come back for her. At the shame sitting plain and unhidden on a face that 3 hours ago had worn only mockery. And something in her chest, some old cold place that had hardened over 11 years of being laughed at for knowing things other people refused to learn, loosened just slightly. "You don't settle a debt like that with one night of regret." she said. You settle it by being a different man tomorrow than you were yesterday. That's the only coin that's ever spent on something like this. Pruitt closed his eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, Naomi Coulter watched Silas Pruitt look like a man who might actually manage to become someone new. Outside, for the first time in hours, the wind's scream had softened into something almost like a sigh. Dawn came gray and merciless clear, the way it always did after a storm had finished saying everything it meant to say. Naomi was first out of the shelter, stepping into a world gone entirely white and silent. The ridge above transformed into a landscape she barely recognized. Drifts taller than a standing man in places, the black skeletal shapes of wrecked wagons jutting up from the snow like the ribs of some great beached animal. The search took the better part of that day and half of the next. It was, Naomi would think many times in the years after, the hardest work she ever did in her life, and also, though it took her longer to understand this part, some of the most important. They found 11 dead in all. 7 adults and, worst of all, for children who had not survived a night in canvas wagons that were never built to hold against wind like that. Among the dead was Josephine Delacroix's mother, found at the bottom of the ravine below the wrecked wagon, and Naomi was the one who told the girl, kneeling in the snow with both of Josephine's small cold hands held tight in her own, because she had promised the girl the truth and she intended to keep every promise she'd made in that shelter through the worst night of both their lives. But 30 survived. 30 souls who had made it off that ridge alive because a woman the train had mocked for reading sky had refused to stop walking back into a blizzard for as long as there was one more voice left to answer. Silas Pruitt did not lead the train again that season. His leg healed crooked, and he walked with a cane for the rest of his days. But it wasn't the leg that kept him from the wagon master's seat. He gave it up himself, freely, the week they finally reached Sweetwater Pass, telling the assembled train. Every survivor gathered in the thin spring sun that had finally broken through, months' worth of grief and gratitude tangled together on every face, that the trail needed a guide who knew when pride had to bow to sense, and that guide wasn't him. It was Naomi Coulter if she'd have the job. She took it, not out of triumph and not to prove anything to the people who had once laughed at her. That need had burned itself out somewhere on the ridge in the dark, tending strangers back from the edge of death with her own hands. But because she understood, now, in a way she hadn't fully understood even after her mother's death, that the knowledge she carried wasn't a curse to be endured alone. It was a gift meant to be given. Josephine Delacroix rode in Naomi's own wagon from Sweetwater Pass onward, and stayed with her long after the trail ended too, in the little settlement that grew up around a good water source and a stand of cottonwood trees that Naomi herself had scouted, reading the land the way her mother had taught her. Ruth Ashby's boy Eli grew up telling anyone who'd listen about the night a lady who knew whether magic carried his mother 2 miles through a blizzard on a mule, and by the time he was a grown man himself, the story had softened at its edges the way stories do, but the true bones of it, the courage, the choice, the walking back into the storm again and again for people who hadn't earned it, never changed at all. Silas Pruitt kept his father's tin medallion until the day he died, an old man by then, settled and gray in the town that had grown up at Sweetwater Pass. But he added something to the leather cord before he passed it, in his own turn, to his eldest granddaughter. A small smooth river stone, given to him by Naomi Coulter herself on the 10th anniversary of that terrible night, with a single word scratched into its face in a careful hand that was not quite her mother's, but close enough to carry the same meaning forward. Endure. Years later, when travelers stopped through the settlement at Sweetwater Pass and asked about the weathered marker at the edge of town. A simple stone cairn, 11 names carved into its face, and beneath them a shorter line that read only they should have listened. The old-timers would tell them the story of the woman who left the trail when everyone mocked her for it, and how the blizzard that claimed so many that terrible night claimed no one at all who had trusted her instead of their own. Stubborn pride. And if the travelers asked what became of her, the old-timers would point west, toward a modest cabin at the edge of the settlement with smoke curling steady from its chimney, where an old woman with silver-streaked hair still watched the sky each evening out of long habit, reading clouds the way other people read faces, and where a granddaughter, Josephine's own daughter named Naomi in her turn, sat on the porch step beside her, learning, patient and rapt, the old woman's careful, hard-earned language of wind and warning and the particular grace of a hand extended back into the storm.